Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have two brilliant poets with us today, Aram Saroyan and Phoebe MacAdams. In 1971, I read On the Mesa, an anthology of Bolinas writing, City Lights, 1971. I had never heard of Bolinas. I had read the poetry of some of the poets. They were the cream of the crop. Why did they go to Bolinas to live? What drew them there? How did they make a living? I wondered. Bolinas is an unincorporated town 13 miles northwest of San Francisco. Its 2021 population is 1,074. In the May 24, 2021 issue of The New Yorker, On the Mesa, an anthology of Bolinas writing, the 50th anniversary edition, The Song Cave 2021, received a superb review. On the Mesa 50th anniversary edition hit #1 on the bestsellers list at small press distribution and is still #1. Aram Saroyan, whose complete minimal poems received the William Carlos Williams Award from the Poetry Society of America, and Phoebe MacAdams, who's had 8 poetry books published, including The Large Economy of the Beautiful, Cahuenga Press, who both have their poetry in the 50th anniversary edition of On the Mesa, are with us today. Aram and his family lived in Bolinas from 1972 to 1984. Phoebe and her family lived in Bolinas from 1969 to 1979. Aram and Phoebe are going to go beyond the review and the new edition to tell us about their lives in Bolinas and to read some poems written in Bolinas. This is a story that is greater than an individual. Was Bolinas the, quote, only instance I could think of where a town was essentially governed by poets, end of quote, as the scholar Lytle Shaw claimed? Aram, why did you and your family move to Bolinas?
You know, Galen and I and our infant daughter, Strawberry, were in London and with 2 friends, Andrew Wiley and Victor Bacchus, who were also writers, aspiring poets. And I had a meeting set up with the BBC. And we were basically sort of hawking our New York Telegraph book project, where we published about 10 different books. And I was hoping to get some publicity for that in England and maybe get an English publisher for it. And the night before I went for this meeting, Galen said to me, well, what are you going to talk about? And I said, well, I guess I'll try to get some promotion, maybe a radio spot with the BBC or something. She said, why don't you think of a project? So we put our heads together and we came up with, well, you know, there's this poets colony called Bolinas, and you know, around San Francisco, up in Marin County. Maybe we could get a show about them and we could go out there. We had visited Tom Clark a couple of years earlier, Tom and Angelica Clark, who had moved there from New York. So I thought, okay, great idea. And I put together this little 1-page prospectus for George Macbeth, who was the BBC contact. And long story short, he liked it. And we ended up going there and doing a radio interview or a series of interviews with a lot of the poets who lived there at the time. And at some point, I think we were talking to Joanne Kiger in her house there. Galen kind of looked at me and said, wow. And it really did seem like a different kind of place than either of us had ever been. It was, you know, rural, and then there were these extraordinary people, like Joanne was a sort of a combination of Virginia Woolf and Kay Kendall, you know, a really extraordinary person. And long story short, we found a place to rent and moved in. And I mean, that's how we got there. Then what happened once we got there was that indeed it was a very, very special place. It was very unlike any place I'd ever lived before. I was a New York kid, or I'd grown up from pre-adolescence in Manhattan to when I was about 22. And now I was, I was 28, but it was, I'd been a writer for about, a little less than a decade, and I'd had some success. I'd published a couple of books with Random House and so on, but I was penniless. There was no income. Later on in life, you look back and you say, oh, yeah, that was a war trying to be the particular kind of literary artist that I was trying to be in this civilization that had, first of all, when I first got engaged by poetry, it was still literature, and writers and poets were still the culture heroes. That was preempted just a few years later by rock and roll, and great singer-songwriters like Dylan and the Beatles and so on. So it was a little bit out of time. And what happened was suddenly there's this oasis of people like me, a lot of them from the East Coast, and very welcoming, saying, oh, hi, you're one of us. And really, I had never had that kind of reception before. It was like, oh, you mean my whole life wasn't a mistake? And so there I was, and we were very gratified to be there. And that's sort of, Phoebe.
Well, I grew up in New York, and then we lived in Buffalo while Lewis was in school with Duncan McNaughton, who also eventually moved to Bolinas. But we were living in San Francisco, and we were living in a commune. And we were living in a commune with Kirsten Creeley's and her husband, Daryl DeVore, her partner. She also eventually moved to Bolinas. And we were living with Daryl, who was a musician who believed that everything is music. So we used to do these incredible concerts, which were eventually on the radio, where we would be playing pots and pans and whatever we had, and that was music. And Daryl somehow made it all work in this incredible way. Eventually, Tom Veach, another poet, moved into a back cabin at the back of the garden on Potrero Hill. And there were all these people living in this commune. And then there were all these people who came to visit. And we started to go nuts. And we thought, we have got to get out of here. This is making us crazy. So Tom Clark, we had come out to California with Tom Clark, another story. He was living in Bolinas. So we came out to see Tom as well. And we fell in love with the place also, and decided that this would be a great place where to live, to rent a house, and raise a family. So we eventually ended up in a house at the end of the block where Tom lived on what was called Nymph Road, overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And that was how we ended up in Bolinas. I have a little thing that I wrote about Bolinas. Shall I read this now or later?
Absolutely.
Okay. About Bolinas. Bolinas, a town of extraordinary people, poets, artists, builders, carpenters, weavers, flute makers, visionaries. We came to Bolinas to not be in the city, to raise a family in the country, among friends, in beauty. And we coalesced in Bolinas around the huge Standard Oil spill of 1971. The oil moving to the beaches and heading to the Bolinas Lagoon one of the premier bird sanctuaries in the country, a national treasure. We gathered on the beach to stop the oil with a homemade boom, logs, telephone poles, bales of hay, cardboard, anything we could find. The oil spill killed upwards of 20,000 birds in spite of our efforts to clean them. However, we did stop the oil from getting into the lagoon. The town came together in community, this deep sense of community. We stopped the state plan to build a huge sewer plant, which would have opened up West Marin to development. We won approval of an environmentally sound sewage treatment system of ponds. We came together and created our town. It was democracy in action. Living in Bolinas was life-changing. So in addition to the poets and artists who lived there, there was this incredible group of all of us creating this town together. Bolinas is in West Marin, north of San Francisco, kind of near Stinson Beach, if you know where that is. And it's a peninsula that goes off of Highway 1 and it dead ends at the ocean. And it's made up of a downtown area, and then there's a hill, a mesa, a flat mesa above the downtown area where most people lived, with two beaches on either side of it. And so it was an extraordinary place. I had never been in a community where people that I knew and loved and respected, I mean, poets and artists, were creating their life together in this way. And it was an incredible place.
Did poets govern the town?
The governing body, Bolinas is unincorporated. And the governing organization of Bolinas is called the Public Utilities District. And it, among other things that it did, it regulated, Bolinas is on a septic tank system. And also it regulated how many water meters were available every year. You can't build a house without a water meter because that's your water. And so eventually the folks that were involved in creating this community ran for the Public Utilities District, and eventually won a majority on the district, on the board. And so one of the first things they did was to enact a moratorium, which was infuriating to the people who had bought property and thought, oh, I'm going to put 4 or 5 houses on this and become a millionaire. They couldn't do it. But the moratorium stuck, which meant that Bolinas could not be overdeveloped. And that was the governing body of the town, that and the school board.
How did the poets make a living?
All right, I want to read you something from, there's a wonderful book by Orville Schell called The Town That Fought to Save Itself. And I want to read you, there's a paragraph that answers this question, because I knew you wanted to know this. Oh, hold on, wrong page. Ironically, since we were trying to limit development and limit houses, but ironically, the largest single employed body of people in town were the building trades. Almost all the work was small scale building. A carpenter contract would hire a few men to build a house, or a plumber, or an electrician, or a carpenter. As a good an organic relationship between builders and the people in this town developed. The only other steady jobs were provided by the school board, the Bolinas Public Utilities District, the Bird Observatory, which was a little ways up north, restaurants, the bar, the post office, the hardware store. Most of these paid very little. And then it makes this quote, this is an old book, $2.50 an hour. Imagine living on that. But people were willing to take them because they were congenial and they didn't have to require an almost impossible commute. In order to get into San Francisco, you had to drive over Mount Tamalpais in this very windy road. A great variety of other people made varying amounts of supplemental income by farming, fishing, baking, babysitting, house painting, cutting firewood, hauling junk, gardening. And then there were the writers and poets who managed to make some part of their incomes by working at home or elsewhere whenever opportunity marked. And then there were retired people who had money, and the young people who lived on welfare or had family money. Most of them lived quite simply in unflamboyant lives of non-conspicuous consumption. So they spent little, and it was kind of putting together whatever you could. There wasn't a major employer in Bolinas.
I want to interject here because it's a kind of an interesting situation that developed with us. We did get a very nice rental for around $350 a month, but neither of us had any savings or any immediate source of income. And I think it was the spring of '73, just within a year or less, maybe half a year after moving in, I managed to get on aid to families with dependent children welfare. And it was on that grant, which I looked at as a sort of substitute Guggenheim, that I wrote my first novel, The Street, which I imagined was going to make me a financial killing. But it stopped a little short on that. And then, at a certain point, I went in and I would be given, a job search each interval, and I would come in and having met with certain employers, but not successfully achieving a job, and they took me off. But that was special too. I mean, thank God, it kind of kickstarted my serious writing, but I wasn't really making enough money ever. And then gradually over, a period of over 10 years, I started to get advances and to make some money and eventually move out. And it was hard to get out of it. It was great to get in Bolinas. And then at a certain point, I realized, a lot of these people, they're not trying that hard. And people like Tom Clark, who was really a peer from way back, was out there churning out books and, working hard to make a living. But generally speaking, we were privileged rich kids, except some of us, as privileged as we were not rich.
We lived on, I had inherited some money from my father. And so that we lived on that for most of the time that we were in Bolinas. And Lewis was on the Public Utilities District Board. And he was very involved in town politics. And he wrote books like Tilth that were generated by what was going on in Bolinas politics and farming in Bolinas.
He was kind of a precursor of what he did with the LA River.
Yeah, he was very involved with politics then. And, then there was a period of time after he left Bolinas where he wasn't. And then when he got back to LA, this is my ex-husband, Louis MacAdams, who started an organization in LA called Friends of the LA River to bring back the LA River. And I think it was in Bolinas where he first realized that his poetic vision and the vision for how you live were one and the same thing.
Yeah, he was a real pioneer in that way.
Yeah.
In the Anthology anniversary edition, Max Crosley, he wrote a couple of pages, and I have a question regarding that. There was two things that he said that I noted. One, quote, "The ultimate junkie is the American consumer," And later he said, no responsibility with money, all on the art. So my question is, was Bolinas an escape from society?
It wasn't, I think that a lot of people wanted to get away from the city. And in some senses it was escape from society, but then it became a place where we tried to create a society and succeeded in doing that. The whole issue of the sewer was an incredible endeavor because the state wanted to put in an enormous sewer project, link up Bolinas with Stinson Beach, and open all of West Marin, which is this gorgeous, pristine place, up for development. It would have ended up being like Marin, like Sausalito. And so the town got together and fought this, and we fought it, in the county offices, and we fought it in county meetings, and finally stopped the sewer. And then there was a biologist, Peter Warshaw, who worked with engineers and created this incredible sewer system that was based on 7 ponds. This is a system that it's used in other places. So they actually got together and did this incredible work, created this alternative to a sewer system, and created this community together. So I don't know if it was maybe an escape from the city to begin with, but then it became a creation of society.
Yeah, there's a wonderful poem by Lou Welsh, which I think I remember by heart, and it goes: Sausalito, Little Willow, perfect beach by the last bay in the world, none more beautiful. Today we kneel at thy feet and curse the men who have misused you. And he was an early denizen of Bolinas. I mean, it was a double-edged sword. But it had an awful lot going for it. And Kenneth Rexroth points out at some point, I don't know where, but I think in one of these interview books, said if I had gone back to New York, I would have lived an entirely different life than the one I lived. It's possible to beat the system on the West Coast. And I know for me, I mean, coming out of New York, there was nothing to do there but sweat. And there's a funny poem that Galen wrote that was not included in the On the Mesa anthology, but it sort of sums up where we were at as young, I guess, hippies in Manhattan. It is called Jobs. One time we both had jobs, Aram and I. We came home after about 2 days of work with $50. We couldn't believe it. We figured it up. What were we going to do with $800 a month? Aram worked as a messenger and I as a waitress. It was patently absurd. We both quit. Well, goodbye to that one. But, it's true. I mean, Tama Janowitz, a few years later, came out with a book called Slaves of New York. And I know exactly what she was talking about. Because if you're going to live in that city, it's too expensive. And you have to hold on to some apartment that's like a hole in the wall that happens to, rent for a little below the line. And the next thing you know, 30 years have gone by. So, and it's different if you're an actor or if you're it's virtually, if you're doing anything other than, what we were doing or what we started by doing.
I love that one line of yours, Aram, in your poem where you said an orange Julius would hit the spot. Because I used to love those orange Juliuses.
Oh, those were great. I don't know why
Gem
they
Spa,
don't.
Gem Spa is closed, right?
Oh, Gem Spa, yeah, with the egg creams.
With the egg
Yeah.
creams. And I also got, I think we got orange Julius's there too.
Really?
I think
There was, I know there was Midtown. There was an actual Orange Julius bar with hot dogs and Orange
I
Julius.
used to get them at the subway stop on 86th Street in Lexington.
Oh, really? That was right near my old neighborhood
Mine too.
when we first moved.
One thing I noticed in the anthology and in the first one too, there were a lot of camaraderie among the poets.
Oh,
Phoebe
yes.
would get mentioned in a poem, and Aram would write a poem about somebody, or people's names going back and forth. And then there were a lot of poems about love and nature and the body. And I thought to myself, it really seems like a real sense of community reading these poets. Was it an idyllic community? Was it a utopia?
Well, the first thing that happened to me, and this just shows you how remote living in Manhattan could have been, was I noticed for the first time in my life the waxing and waning of the moon.
Oh my, right. Well, you wouldn't in New York.
And
You came out to Bolinas after the oil spill, right?
yes, right on the heels of the oil spill, and there was this amazing sense of community and sense of accomplishment that they had, as Mario Savio put it, started working with the levers of power where they were, and it was really powerful. That moment of empowerment, that there was that joke, never trust anyone over 30. And here we were just about at the turning point I was, and finding our own peers kind of like in the position of town fathers.
Mm-hmm.
Where else did that happen? It just like kind of amazing.
Well, you each have said how you came to get to Bolinas. There were a bunch of poets that ended up there, as you both know better than I do. What is there a generalization that why so many poets, so many excellent poets ended up in Bolinas, or was it just as you went there for the reason you stated, Aram and Phoebe hers, or was it just a happenstance?
No, I don't think it was happenstance. I mean, Tom Clark was there, and Tom told people about Bolinas. People came out to visit. They end up staying there. Joanne Kiger, who had lived in Bolinas, oh gosh, she was there before we were there. And Joanne is, maybe not known in the larger world of American literature, but among poets, and particularly a certain kind of poet, she was an incredibly important figure to us and to many people. And people would come and see her all the time. And so people kind of gathered to visit and then ended up staying there. Bill Berkson came out, and then he started, and then when people came out, they started publishing. I mean, Bill started publishing. There were magazines, and then the newspaper, which is eventually called the Hearsay News. The newspaper was an incredible fixture. What happened with the newspaper is the people who were, it was 3 days a week, and people it rotated editors. And I read this description. It was actually Lewis who said this. We would gather in the morning at the Hearsay News office and have a glass of wine or have a joint. And the deal was anybody who had news would come to the Hearsay News office and tell us what the news was. And whatever they told us went into the newspaper that day. And so it was this incredible kind of combination of local gossip, important things that were going on in town, what people were selling. Eventually, the police blotter was in it. And they would write it up that day, go next door to the guy who was responsible for printing it, and the newspaper would come out that night. And so it was this amazing combination of real news and what was going on in everybody's life. That was an important part of Bolinas. That's a sort of side question to yours about how people got there. But I
Well,
think
absolutely. And it was invented by the town butcher, Michael Rafferty.
that's right, Mike Rafferty.
And
And he named it. He named it.
The Bolinas Hearsay News.
Which you can still get a subscription to if you're interested. It's still ongoing.
That's the real story of Bolinas. Somebody should put that between, well, I mean, I guess it'd be multi-volumes.
I'm sure
The
I hope they
poetry
have that
reading-
somewhere.
Were there poetry readings in Bolinas?
Yes.
Oh,
There-
were they?
one of the traditions, and this was one of the things that got to me, was any visiting poet, at least in the early days, would be asked to give a reading at the BPUD office, the Town Public Utility Building office.
They had a big hall in it, in the building.
Yeah. And I remember giving a reading, and it was like I had just arrived, and maybe there were, a dozen or more, maybe 20 people there, but it seemed like I knew all of them. And they were very nice to me. And I thought, oh my God, where did I find this? So it was just immediately supportive. And what happened to me at that point is I had been writing these very minimal poems, which had become sort of notorious. And I hadn't really written for 5 years. I'd gotten together with Galen and we had started a family. But the amount of approval that just came over in waves from this society was enough to kickstart me into the next phase as a writer, which involved, really writing with my own voice about my own experience and had nothing to do necessarily with the sort of minimalist stuff that I'd been involved with. So it really, I think if Freud were to characterize it, it was like for the first time, my superego, which had been looking over my shoulder and criticizing me, merged with my ego. And suddenly I became, my voice admitted more of myself into it. And that was a big turning point for me. And I can't imagine it would have happened anywhere else, frankly.
Here's someone wrote, Michael Wolf wrote, employment in Bolinas. Owning the Bolinas bookstore kept me on ink and paper and food and rent for about 5 years. And then he also wrote community, a newspaper, a university, a free box, an autonomous government, no sheriff.
Yes, and that bookstore was terrific. And then he started Timbuktu Books, which published
Right.
the first edition of Jim Carroll's The Basketball Diaries. It also published
My first book.
Published your first book and published Galen's first book.
And that he did in Bolinas. And the
Yeah.
bookstore was great. I worked at the bookstore and never managed to make the accounts quite gel. But it was a wonderful bookstore. No, unfortunately, the bookstore no longer exists.
Were there any poetry mags came out of Bolinas, and was there a governing poetic aesthetic?
At the library, there was a special corner where everybody who received, the little magazines that a lot of people got in those days would just recycle those magazines, so you could pick them up. And
there were magazines. There was the Turkey Buzzard Review. That was
that's
one magazine that came out of Bolinas. And then Bill had a magazine.
Big Sky.
Big Sky started in Bolinas, and that was a magazine before he did books. So
Bill
there
Bergson?
were, yeah.
He did books a little later on, but simultaneously. Yeah.
You know, we have about 23 minutes left, and it is a poetry show, and you have been talking about the poets and poetry, but I think it might be a good idea for each one of you to read a couple of poems.
Oh, I'd love to do that.
The anthology or the original On the Mesa, or from poets, yourselves included, who wrote in Bolinas, if you would. Phoebe, do you want to start off?
Yeah, and let me, I'm going to start with a poem by Joanne Kiger, and I just want to talk a little bit about Joanne. Joanne was born in Vallejo and then went to school in Santa Barbara and moved to San Francisco in 1957. She was a student and friend of Jack Spicer, Robert Duncan, and the poets of the San Francisco Renaissance. She was married for a while to Gary Snyder from 1960 to 1964 and moved to Bolinas in 1969. And I would say that she was the muse of Bolinas poets and of Bolinas. She was the kind of guiding spirit of Bolinas. And she kind of kept this large spirit, kept our spirits kind of intact. And she was an amazing woman to talk to. And I love your description of her, Aram. Anyway, I'm going to read this poem that she wrote. First, and this is in the anthology. First, there were giants. First, there were giants. And then getting consciousness, I mean, mind aware, became gods. And then man came out of gods, as it was more familiar. And then God was above them. And then God became man again. And now we walk different. Not man anymore, not God anymore. One mind to leave. One mind holds on. I mean, the body walks with feet on the earth, the head out into the stars. I'm not just one, all past and present here, face down by Pacific reaches, who, as it is grounded, the new spirit brought down here by the mother, helped by the father, who throws his waste spirit away. No aids, no body is left as his support in the sky, as substance, or coming around again into new bodies, never lets go of an intensity, taking us on into angels, in you, on you, with you.
Wow. That isn't one of the Miwok poems that she translated, is it?
I don't think so.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it. It sort of starts in that key, but then it just goes into the stratosphere. Yeah, amazing.
Here's another one by her, shorter. It's the Under the Green Light. You see, when the new spirit came along, it had to get on top of the old spirits. So the old spirits were pushed underground by the weight. And they're only dark when seen from the perspective of light, because the new spirit saw them as raw, untidy, out of order. And they only moved at night and tried to be out of sight, forgotten in this dusty corner. Oh, eek, get that spider out of here. Under the ground in seed holes and hanging from trees upside down, and lost souls who don't know which way to go, dark or light, good or bad. Say, O leader of the lost, promise me the company of the dark. Oh, the passing smell, the shimmer of evil. Oh, it grows like a snake, moves like the strongest, most beautiful, dream in the world. Green flashes, sparks, cups.
Wow. It reminds me, I was looking at this anthology, and I have a selection that actually involves, pretty much as I remember it, both the first, there are only 3 poems, and one is the first I wrote in Bolinas, and the other is the last. And there's I guess, a difference of about 10 years, or a little less than 10 years between them. But this is the first, and it's for, appropriately, Tom Clark, who basically was the impetus to get there in the first place. Big city boys come out to the country, toy with the idea of becoming farmers, forgetting their nervous systems for a while. It almost seems easy. Why write poetry about dock strikes? Their wives cooperate with nature so well, or seem to know their own rhythm better than men. Creatures of crude habit. Perhaps an Orange Julius might hit the spot right now. They think, circling and circling the precise matter of their own home, and children come into this as quickly as they find themselves a place in it. Meanwhile, the planet spins and keeps time perfectly with the universe, like a guitar solo by Eric Clapton, Derek and the Dominoes. It all seems to fit, nothing impressionably wrong or jarringly accurate even. That too, becoming useless as we go on in this life, soon to hit 30, soon to hit 29, and getting better all the time. It's funny, somebody in the editorial department changed the last line, and I thought, how dare they? And then I realized, I think they did it, that this was the right choice. The last part of the line was, and getting better and better all the time. I didn't need that extra better. No. And I'll add the last poem here. This is like 10 years later. And this was my late wife, Galen's favorite poem that I ever wrote. Basically, we're still trying to figure out what it means. But I woke from a dream. And this was just a few weeks before I heard that my dad was dying. Day and night, like a drop of ink as it hits the water, the whole glass going black. In death and vision, decompression, the soul united across space and time, the heart that was blind, a healed thing, whole. This is what the poet knows, and how he grows apart. O foolish one, oblivious of broken light, the one contained holds the day, the one apart the night.
Beautiful.
That's great.
Thank you.
I love the clarity and the lyricism in these poems. And you two have continued to write over the years, and it just seems like it has been a very enriching program of a life that you both led in Bolinas, and both of you had families there. I mean, that must have been, was that unusual, or were there a lot of people there with families, or was it just single people coming there, poets looking for their way?
I
To
think
me, it distinguishes our generation relative, like, to the Beats and the hipsters. A lot of us had families.
and a lot of us came to Bolinas in order to raise families. I think the people who visited, like Ted and Alice at that point did not have families, Joe Brainerd, they came and left. But the people who were living in Bolinas, for the most part, had families.
It was a perfect place to raise kids.
Oh, yeah, and there was a great school, and the town was very much involved with the school. It was a whole nother story.
Yeah.
So there was a school there. When the kids got to be high school age, they had to go over the hill to go to high school. But all up till high school, they could go to school in Bolinas and then in Stinson Beach. The middle school was in Stinson.
Have either of you returned to Bolinas since you were originally there in a recent time?
Oh yeah, I go back every year if I can. My son, Ocean, his wife, who he went to school with at the Bolinas school, and they eventually got together years later. Her parents still live in Bolinas. And so they live in San Francisco, and they go and visit her parents a lot. And her parents are, so our kids are very active in Bolinas. Because they go visit their grandparents and go horseback riding, and Ocean goes out there to surf. So, and I go out there. I used to go out there. There's a big 4th of July celebration, and I used to go out. Once they moved to San Francisco, I went out there for the 4th of July celebration.
One thing I noticed, a lot of New York second generation poets, Aram for one, Lewis, and some of the people you mentioned, Phoebe.
Yeah.
Did that change the poetics of the place, or was it just, were people coming out there for, like you two lived there for 10 years? Did those other people come there for a long stay like you, or were they just there for like a vacation? Or
no, Bill lived there for years. I mean, Bill still has his family still has a house in Bolinas.
Oh, really? Is that still there?
That house is, yeah, the kids still own that house.
Oh, nice.
I think they do. No, we stayed, Bill stayed, Aram stayed, Tom Clark stayed. Ted and Alice came to visit and left. I mean, Bolinas was not the place for Ted Berrigan. He didn't understand the politics at all. Joe Brainerd wrote a wonderful book, the Bolinas Diaries, but eventually he left.
Well, he wasn't there for that long. I mean, that's
long enough to write that book, and did an incredible series of paintings that was all based on eucalyptus leaves.
Oh, really?
Oh God, they're gorgeous.
Oh, wow. I'd love to see those. Yeah, but he was kind of a Manhattanite, I guess.
Oh yeah.
I mean, he's so charming, and it was interesting because I think the New Yorker Review picked up on his vision of Bolinas, which was not particularly accurate.
No.
But
and then there was Bob Creeley. Bob and Bobby Creeley had a house. There was a road that went from downtown up to the Mesa, and their house, they had this big farmhouse they bought right in the middle of that road, and they had this huge kitchen table, and there was like this salon that went on in Bob and Bobby's house, where you would go in and sit down at that table and talk for hours. And Bob had a little studio in the back, and wrote incredible books while he was in Bolinas. But I wouldn't say that there's a Bolinas school of poetry. Bob's poetry is very different from Tom Clark's poetry, very different from Lewis's, very different from Bill's. There was a kind of unified spirit of acceptance, permission, and community, but there wasn't a school of poetry. I agree. I think everybody would have been offended by the thought, even because everybody was doing what they were doing, and that was part of Bolinas. You kind of had permission to do what you were doing.
Did any of you go into San Francisco and do poetry readings there?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. definitely.
have one of the selections. I'll read you a selection about driving into San Francisco to go to a poetry reading. And I mentioned all of these poets in this, and the poets were Joanne Kiger, Bobby Louise Hawkins, Michael McClure. And in this, I just want to say this in advance in light of what's going on in New York. In this poem, Michael McClure puts his hand on my stomach, and he was not doing anything untoward. I was pregnant, and he was just, like you do, you put your hand on a friend's belly to feel the baby. So that was what that was all about. Just have to say that for Michael. Wall of Words. On the occasion of a reading by John Ashbery, I was listening to a line of words. I had opened all the doors and windows, and the words were becoming walls, floor, ceiling, and chair I was sitting on. I lay down and rolled over and drifted off and came back, sat up, listening. I was thinking about New York, put my feet up, and still the words were coming. Again, I opened, listening. Later at the party, I was still listening. We had been talking earlier in the car about how hard it is to be naked in front of strangers. I was wearing a long purple print dress with a low neckline. Bobby commented that it would be an easy party to leave, which made us feel better. And then I was talking to Gerard. He didn't remember coming to our house dressed in white and meditating on the rug. I hadn't believed that act anyway, and he'd given up TM. The curl in his lip was back, and he was tough and naughty and ambitious again. Thank heavens. He went to get a strawberry for my wine. And then we were talking about firewood and Bolinas and thieves, and John said he didn't like the feeling of hot lips. He said he was afraid of getting burnt. He smiled a hideous smile and walked away, the line of words inside him. Michael put his hand on my stomach. I looked for a while into his tender eyes, and then he and Bobby were talking in an articulate fashion about everything that had just happened. She was wearing a brown dress and sweater, brown hose, and her fur coat. Joanne was wearing a blue dress, sandals, many elegant shawls, 2 exquisite rings of pearl, ruby, and diamond. We had bought our dresses at the same store. And then I stopped listening, and we were running down the stairs, laughing. Michael said he was a French restaurant. We got in the car and ate burritos over the hill to Bolinas. Bobby drove. Bobby and Joanne were talking. I was looking out at the fog and the stars, listening.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Wonderful.
Well, this has been a very loving, informative, refreshing hour, and we have a few minutes left. I would just like each one of you maybe to take a minute, if you would, or two, and just answer the question, why did you leave Bolinas? Aram?
Well, we left for a combination of reasons. One was that I had a contract to do a book, the first really significant contract I'd ever gotten. So we had some money, and that was a big thing because getting out of the place was going to be expensive. And, I could work with my editor directly in Manhattan, in, where we moved, which was Ridgefield, Connecticut. We were only there for about 3 years, but it gave our kids a broader horizon. We had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. And by that time, it was different. I just felt like I need to move on. There's this myth that the Indians there, the native Indians of that particular area, would go to Bolinas as a healing place, but they wouldn't stay there after a certain amount of time. And that kind of made sense to me. it was great. And then you needed to take whatever you'd gotten and go forward with it for me.
I left because my marriage to Lewis was falling apart. And my mother called me up and said, you know, there's a wonderful house. My mother lived in Colorado Springs. She said, there's a wonderful house here of a friend of mine who's going to be on sabbatical for a year or two. Why don't you come here and we can help you with the kids? I had 2 kids. And so I left for that reason. I moved to Colorado Springs to be with my mother when I split up with Lewis, so that she could help me with the kids. And that was great. You know, and it's funny, you know, it was kind of time to leave. And the only person who really stayed in Bolinas was Joanne Kiger. Well, the poets anyway. And Tom Clark eventually moved to Berkeley. But I can't think of anybody else who was a poet except for
Bill went to San Francisco after a while, but it was after quite a while.
Who?
Bill Berkson.
Right.
Jennifer, I see. What would you like to say about this hour?
This has been very fun. I don't have that reference. I've never been to Bolinas. I didn't know about the community, but I hopped on because Aram, there was something that you said about taking what you could from the community and then moving on that I found true for my life in Chicago. But I think it's about the community that you plug into. If you're someone that's creative and you thrive on that, it's understanding that there's a season for those people that you're connected with in that moment, in the late 20s, early 30s, when you're trying to figure out what your real passion is and how you can go about living your life in a satisfied way but still making rent. And yeah, that resonated with me.
And I ended up, Margot Patterson Dawes, who was one of the first people who I knew in Bolinas, when I said I was moving to Southern California because Lewis and I wanted to be near each other so we could raise the kids together, she said to me, you should go and look at Ojai. Ojai is the Bolinas of Southern California. And that was how I ended up living in Ojai when I got down here. So,
Well, I see it's 1:59. And Jennifer, once again, we've had a wonderful show. Thanks to you for asking for this show. And Aram and Phoebe, you two are just not only wonderful writers, but you're also great prose writers. And you're just so authentic and refreshing. That's what I'll just say. It was a refreshing hour. So thank you once again. And here's Jennifer. And thank you, Jennifer.
thank you so much, Harry. And thank you, Jennifer and Aram.
Thank you.